The first sample we're going to do is how to do a set-in sleeve. Here's a finished product that's been done with 1/2-inch seam allowances. And here are the patterns that I've already cut out, adding the 1/2-inch seam allowance. Actually, I added 5/8 because that's a more standard seam allowance. So I cut this sleeve with 5/8 of an inch extra fabric beyond the sleeve cap and the side seams. I also cut a bodice front and a bodice back with a seam allowance at the shoulder and the arm's eye and the side seam, so that we could sew the shoulders together, set in the sleeve, but we also have to have the side seam done. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do that much to begin with. Before we can set in the sleeve, we will sew a shoulder seam and a side seam, and then we'll put the sleeve in that. So I am using a 5/8 inch seam here. I am back tacking and starting the underarm seam. This one had a dart in it, so it's going to not exactly. So now my bodice is ready. I'm clipping the threads, and I'm going to get the sleeve ready. I like to do a basting stitch, kind of an easing stitch on the sleeve cap. Your pattern will have a single notch in the front of the sleeve and a double notch in the back of the sleeve, and possibly a notch or a dot in the top center so that you can match that to the top of your shoulder. So between those notches and slightly in from the seam line, we want a long basting stitch just over the curve of the sleeve. Sometimes in a real project you might want to put 2 rows of basting, the next one just inside of there in case one breaks. For this project we'll be fine. So after the basting stitch, now I go back to a normal stitch and sew the sleeve underarm seam. If you want to do this assignment with a full-size sleeve and bodice, you can. It takes a little more fabric, but it's easier to work in the space of a regular sleeve than in this half size. It's kind of small and tight. But the next step is to, I should press all these seams open. We won't see them again, so you won't know that I didn't. But you want to be able to put right sides together when you sew this sleeve into the bodice. So I'm going to put the sleeve right side out and the bodice inside out, and then I have right sides together. And the first step is always to line up the underarm seam. Again, let's make sure these seams are open. And pin those 2 together. And then you can match your notches. And this part of the sleeve is not eased or gathered. It's smooth and it lines up exactly. And I'm matching the front notch to the front bodice. I should be demonstrating with a big one. Now, in order to match this center notch to the top shoulder seam, I also need that seam open. Please open. Thank you. So now I can see how much extra fabric I need to ease in with my gathering stitch. And I find one of those tails of string and pull it up so the gathers fit in that sleeve cap. Then I do the other side the same way. It doesn't take very much gathering, and you really want it to concentrate at the top of the cap of the sleeve. There's a little less down here and more here, if anything, because you need that sleeve to curve around the shoulder. But I'm calling this easing because I don't want to see any actual folds or pleats or puckers sewn in the fabric. I'm just working it in smoothly so that it will create ease in there. Now this part's going to be harder because it's a very teeny opening. But I'm going to start at the underarm seam and on my seam line. Getting my seam allowance over here to the 5/8 inch line. I do one stitch by hand, and then I'm going to hold the threads as I begin to sew. And I didn't hit that pin. I could take it out now that I've sewed that. The others I will take out as I come to. But even with only 4 pins around this sleeve, I'm going to do a little bit of matching up the raw edges inside this teeny little hole. It's really hard to hold. I should cut out a big one. So as you come towards the top, you start to see your ease stitches. And I want that pin to stay for a minute. And I'm going to work them in smoothly so I don't have any puckers there. And I'm stitching just to the left of that basting stitch because I put it just inside the seam line. So now I've still got my notches matching my top seam, but I want to smooth out the gathers and not stitch any in. Now I'm going over the top and still trying to create a smooth line. You do have to flip your bodice around and keep it flat underneath this round arm's eye. Very carefully. And keep moving in a circular line, following the curve. Wherever the arm's eye curves to, that's where you want to lay it out flat and follow that curve until you come all the way back around to where you started. Still keeping the seam open. And you overlap where you started from and do a few stitches to connect them, and then you can take it out. Okay, so here's the goal. I should have an equal seam allowance all the way around, and when I I open it, I should see a sleeve with smooth fullness, rounding at the top. This is where your shoulder protrudes, but you don't want to see any puckers or tucks all the way around here. And then an ideal finish would be to serge this seam. In fact, another good idea would be to do another row of stitching just inside this one, so you have it double stitched, very strong for a sleeve set in. And then serge off the seam allowance, and it's finished.